Before we get stuck into our disagreements, let's establish the common ground, which is important. Otherwise, you can't have a genuine conversation. The common ground is that we both believe in democracy, and we both believe in decentralized market systems. Because the alternative is central planning, which either takes the form of Gosplan in the Soviet Union, we know how that ended, or Amazon.com, which is another form of the Soviet system. It's actually even worse.
Get to that later.
In the sense that it is totally centralized and the exact opposite of both democracy and the market. Amazon.com is not a market. Platform is not a market. It's a simulation of a market, but not of the kind that Adam Smith had in mind, or any liberal would have in mind or tolerate. So we agree on that. And the struggle to deter tyranny from rising up, the struggle to prevent ourselves, each one of us, because we have a darkness in ourselves as human beings, and whenever we acquire power, this darkness becomes more powerful and more insidious and more dangerous. I think as true children of the Enlightenment, we are on that common ground. By the way, congratulations on the book. It's a great read. You should read it. And highly informative. Even though I have covered in my own professional life all those areas and periods and so on, I learned a lot. The gist of it, as I see it, and I think you already said, Martin, is that you recognize that, call it what you might, liberal democratic capitalism, is the best of all alternatives, but it is also broken and needs to be fixed. And you have ideas of how to do this. So the big question is, and I think this is also reflected in the title. Yeah. Should we fix it? Should we abandon it? What should we do about it? Now, here is where the differentiation between our views begins. Imagine this were 1776 here in London. And we're having a conversation about the system that prevailed at the time, which we now call feudalism. They didn't call it feudalism, right? Or it was still considered along the lines of feudalism. And imagine there was a whole conversation about how to civilize it. That conversation would have been besides the point, because by the 1770s, feudalism was on the way out. There was already a very powerful economic and social force called capital that was replacing land as a source of value added and power. Mm-hmm. And that led to the conflict between the aristocracy and the bourgeoisie, the merchant class, and to some synthesis, which is liberal democratic capitalism. I didn't choose 1776 randomly. It was a year when Adam Smith published his Wealth of Nations. The whole point about that book was to say that there is this transformation, historic, great transformation, in the words of Karl Polanyi, taking place. And the old was being jettisoned by forces that nobody really understood. And this is why Adam Smith's book became such a great bestseller, because things were happening that people had no clue of how to explain them. You had a new class emerging that was extremely powerful economically, but for the first time, economic and political power were differentiated, had split up. Up until then, if you had political power, you were the prince, the baron, the king. You also had economic power. But at some point, you have these merchants that are scum in the eyes of the aristocracy, but they have more power, more money than the aristocracy. So there was a need to explain how the rise of capital and the usurpation of land and the replacement of ground rent by profit and capital accumulation was changing the world. I feel, this is my conviction, and that's why I'm finishing a book now that you very kindly mentioned, is coming out in September. I feel that we are at a similar juncture, that capitalism is being undermined and replaced by a new socioeconomic mode of production, which is highly problematic, very interesting, fascinating, huge challenge for humanity, and who is the agent of change? In the 1770s, it was merchant capital, it was capital accumulation, it was capital. The agent of change today is again capital. It's not the left. The left, we have failed spectacularly at transforming the world. When we did transform the world, we made a mess of it. And then we just went to ground, and we are now, my party is at 4% in Greece. And the Labour Party is not even trying anymore under Keir Starmer to transform anything except themselves. So, it's capital. Capital has produced, in my view, a mutation of capital. I call it cloud capital, algorithmic capital.
The tech companies.
Yes, but not so much the capital. It's a new form of, allow me just very quickly to explain what I'm saying. Capital, the way I understand it, is a produced means of production. Anything that's been produced in order to produce other stuff, whether it's a steam engine, an industrial robot, a 3D printer. You produce something to produce other stuff. That's a produced means of production. Cloud capital is a produced means of behavioral modification. So, preaching, discussing, advertising, marketing is an attempt at behavior modification. But when behavior modification, the agent of it is capital, machinery, an algorithm, which is in a dialectical conversation with people in their own homes over the phone and so on. Alexa, Amazon's Alexa. What exactly is Amazon's Alexa? It's a machine that trains you to train it, to train you to train it, to train it to convince you to buy stuff through first impressing you with fantastic proposals as to what you should buy, and then sells it to you using the same algorithm, bypassing the market, via a platform. That is a new kind of algorithm.
I'm fascinated that you've identified the power of the algorithm in quite that way, because having read your last book, I obviously haven't read the new book, I imagined one of the points I wanted to make to you was, does the power of the algorithm and the way in which it sucks our attention, does that make it much harder to persuade people to engage in the kind of society, in the kind of political change that you envisage or imagine in that book?
Not necessarily. I don't want to be pessimistic, and I don't want to have this surveillance capitalism view that Big Brother is here and our minds have been hijacked. I'm talking about a new form of capital which creates a new feudalism up in the cloud, because if you think about it, today you've got millions of producers producing apps for Apple, for Google, for Facebook, physical products that they sell through Amazon. And when you get it from them, they pay, or you pay, or together you and the producer pay 30% of a ground rent to the owner of the new land, which is the cloud. And so we are Martin, in his book, he talks about rentier capitalism. Yeah. I think now we've moved beyond rentier capitalism.
Okay, Martin,
this is not capitalism anymore. It's a kind of cloud rent feudalism.